So, good evening, everyone. I can see on my screen that there are more participants that are still joining. The numbers are still ticking up, and we're expecting close to 500 people at this session. For many of you, Zoom conversation is a new experience, and I'm assuming because you're on Zoom that you all know how to use it. Just to let you know that we can't see any of you on this screen, only the speakers, I presume, can be seen on the screen. And one of the nice things about Zoom is that it also allows for Q&A. And the way we're going to conduct this is that about 15 minutes towards the end of our conversation, I'm going to start looking at the Q&A box. I know that people are very anxious to share with me the experience of conversing and interviewing our guest. I'll introduce in a moment, but I think it makes most sense, rather than having rolling Q&A that will just disappear, for me to look at the questions towards the end. So if you can hold off, because I won't be looking at it for a large part of this interview, as is the custom if it was an actual live event. But it is a live event, and welcome. And even though it feels that Zoom transcends place and space, and we're easily talking to someone in London, and I'm talking here from Australia, but I'm in a specific place in Australia, in the city of Port Phillip in St Kilda. And so I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Bunurong people and paying our respect to elders past and present and emerging. But we're here now to have a conversation with a writer who has built an incredibly distinguished career, and I could spend this entire session just introducing our speaker, but you all know Philippe Sands as a distinguished international lawyer. We recently, so I personally watched it at the International Court of Justice, and later I want to talk about the difference philosophically between that court and the ICC, because I think it goes to the heart of some of your work about the collective and the individual. But I saw you defending and prosecuting Myanmar, an entire country, on the charge of genocide, and that's significant, on behalf of the Rohingya people. And you've defended as an international lawyer, or prosecuted as an international lawyer, war criminals from various countries in your career, and you're very clearly, and I think what has drawn so much interest in this conversation, that you're so multifaceted. As well as being a lawyer, you're a writer, and on this book, which I would urge everyone to buy. It's all the books that you've written are listed here, and I won't go through them all, but some of them are academic books about the principles of international environmental law, justice for crimes against humanity, and most famously, East-West Street, which shares a very similar cover with different people on the book that we're going to be focusing on today, The Ratline, Love, Lies and Justice on the Trail of a Nazi Fugitive. And so I'd like to begin by talking about the book, because we're in COVID lockdown, as you are in England. Most people, bookstores are closed, and Australia Post is very slow. And so I'm going to assume, because it's also not available for download on Kindle, we're going to have to assume, because it's just literally come out in Australia, that most people who are listening to this haven't actually read the book. And I've spent the last few days since getting this book kind of living with you, and it would add to the atmosphere. I can see you've got a record player, vinyl player at the back, if you put on Bach's and Passion, St Matthew's Passion, and that would be appropriate, given that the characters you've written about were very influenced by that music. But you more than anyone capture so many different dimensions. You're an international lawyer, a barrister. You've written numerous books, as I've said, You also, many of us would have seen you at the Art Centre here, at least in Melbourne, where you did the Song of Good and Evil that was based on East West Street. You have made a film called My Nazi Legacy, which is which really intersects both of these two books. You have a 10-part podcast on the BBC, Intrigue, on the Ratline. And what I was trying to do my own detective work, imitating you. What actually led you through these myriad factors to write this book? So I tried to put the puzzle together, but I'd like you to, and in doing that, we'll delve deeper into the significance of it. But if you could perhaps explain to people what the book is about and what drew you to the book, assuming that, as I said, they haven't read it. So welcome, Philippe.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Jewish Book Week in Melbourne. I'm so sorry that I'm not with you. I was due to be with you, and travel permitting, I hope I'll be with you next year, not least because I hope to have a daughter who is studying her third year in Australia, and we want to come and visit her if they allow her in. I didn't know, actually, the book was not available on Kindle in Australia, because in the UK it is, and that has accounted for about 50% of the sales. It's also available in the UK on an audiobook. I don't know whether you can get that in Australia, but that has done particularly well because the reader on that with me is Stephen Fry, who many of you will know. I mean, the Ratline, I think I wouldn't call it a sequel, but it is very closely connected to East West Street. Those of you who've read East West Street will know there is a minor character in the book called Otto Wächter, who is the deputy to Hans Frank, and he was governor first of Krakow and then of Galicia. And at the end of the war, he escaped. Unlike Hans Frank and others, he was indicted, but he was never caught. I was introduced to his son Horst by Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank. In introducing me, Nicholas said, well, he's different from me. You'll like him, but he's different from me. I detest my father. He has a positive feeling towards his father. But we went off and met, and one thing led to another. I mean, I didn't plan to write East West Street. I didn't plan to write this book. What happened was that I started by writing. I was so fascinated by Horst, who sort of looked for the good in his father. I should say at the outset, Horst is not a Nazi, and Horst is not, I think, he's not an apologist for his father in the sense that he accepts his father was involved in the final solution. His father was involved in the killings of many, many people, including my grandfather's family. What Horst has trouble accepting is the characterization of his father as a criminal, and that is the gap between us. Halfway, I mean, we've known each other for about 10 years. In about 2015, there was a moment where something happened that caused Horst to say to me, would you like to see my parents' archives, the letters, the diaries, all of the materials? And I said yes, and a couple of weeks later, a single USB stick popped through my letterbox here in London, in North London, and I put it in my computer, and it was basically 10,000 pages of material, most of it in German, most of it handwritten, largely indecipherable to my eye anyway. A lot of photographs. I started with those, and I sort of left it hanging around. I'd pop in periodically, and then one of my colleagues here at UCL, sadly no longer with us, the wonderful Lisa Jardine, had given a lecture, her inaugural lecture at UCL, Temptation in the Archives, she called it, and it explored the historical value of personal documents, correspondence, and diaries. What is their historical value? And it was she who suggested that we start a research project to analyze all of this material. And there was stuff I wanted to know. As I mentioned, Otto Wächter disappeared after the war. He turned up 4 years after he disappeared in a Vatican-run hospital in Rome, hoping to get to Argentina on something called the Ratline, but he died. And I wanted to know what happened in those 4.5 years. And so we spent 4 years deciphering the material, and the product, of course, is the Ratline. It's a complicated story in many ways, not least because you could characterize it as a love story between Charlotta and Otto, two rabid Nazis, both anti-Semites, And with 20 years of material, I was able to trace their entire lives. And frankly, that became increasingly fascinating because I think for many of us, there is a central question. How could people who were so cultured, so educated, so decent in their own lives to each other up to a point, how could they participate in such a horror? And that remains a very big question.
Right. So there are many questions that in the epigraph of your book, you quote a Spanish writer who comes from a family of fascists, and the writer Javier Cercas says that it's more important to understand the butcher than the victim. And in this book, you have traced somebody who, well, the son will deny it, and we'll come back to how the son feels about his father, how Horst feels about Otto. But you've really focused on the life of somebody who was complicit, responsible, we'll talk about that, for mass murder, the butcher. And yet it's also clear that you don't come from a fascist home, and that the story, as with East-West Street, is also a very personal story. And it goes back to my earlier question about all of these different dimensions of you, that you're the prosecutor, but you're also the grandson. You're also, as in the film, as in this book, you're exploring the reason you've chosen him is because Otto Wächter was the governor of Galicia and and therefore had authority in Lemberg, but also your family hometown, Żółkiew. And so it's a very personal story to you. And you don't just do what a lawyer, I think, does, which is amass evidence and a mountain of evidence, but you have this throughout this whole experience is a journey for you. You physically go on a journey to all these places, that sense of being there with Horst and at times with your own daughter, climbing the mountains where, to cross to Italy where Otto escapes and hides. That's very important to you as well, standing in place. And so I want to ask you, is this book really, how do you balance for you personally, the butcher and the victim, your role as a lawyer, prosecutor, and your own personal story?
Sure. I mean, it's a very personal story. I mean, I wrote it, the whole thing started, as readers of East-West Street will know, with this unexpected invitation to give a lecture in the city of Lviv, where my grandfather was born. And it was about getting to know him, about the period he would never talk about. And I know for many of the people who are watching this now that it will be a very familiar story. We knew our parents or grandparents had been through terrible things, but we didn't want to ask about it. And I reached an age of 50 where all of a sudden I get this invitation and a door opens and it leads endlessly. So in a sense, it's a homage to my grandfather, but it's also about identity and memory. It's about knowing who my grandfather was. And in knowing who my grandfather was, knowing who I am and who my children are. Let's go back to Javier Cercas. Just to be clear, Javier Cercas is not a fascist. There were fascist elements in his family. You weren't suggesting that. Yeah. He is one of Spain's great writers. Some of you will have read him. If you have not read him, you might want to start with a book which is titled Soldiers of Salamis, which tells a story of a moment in the Spanish Civil War. He's one of my favorite writers. I came to know him on a panel in France about 3 years ago, and he struck me as remarkable, and we became friends. In writing the Ratline, and as you know from reading my work, I'm pretty methodical. A place comes up, I want to go and see it. It's not enough to look at it on the web. I need to be there, I need to be in the room. And in particular, the book opens with a photograph. The first photograph in the book is the room in which Otto Wächter dies. And I spent 4 years trying to get into that room because it's in a Vatican hospital, and I can't get access to it. It's closed, and it's closed to me. For lots of reasons that were not pernicious, I have to say. It was being restored. It was just not being used anymore. But it was an incredible room. And I wanted to be in that space. I wanted to know where Otto Wächter spent the last 4 days of his life. And I wanted to get a feel for that room. So I tried and tried and tried. And then one day Javier Cercas emails me and he says, amazing, Philippe. The Pope has asked me to come and give a lecture in the Vatican on faith and literature. And I just thought you'd be interested, he said. And I write back and I say, well, actually, I'm not just interested, but you're going to meet some pretty high up people. If you could possibly get me into the room where Werther died, I'd be totally thrilled. And he sort of said, well, okay, I'll try. I'll see what I can do. Next thing that happens is actually, since you mentioned it, I retraced the escape route of Otto Werther. I crossed the Dolomites on foot with my then 19-year-old daughter, the one who's coming to Australia next year. It was an extraordinary journey, but once we'd crossed the Dolomites and we were coming down the other side, heading towards Bolzano, a series of emails arrives from Javier Cercas saying, you're not going to believe this. I gave my lecture last night. Afterwards, I met the number 2 in the cultural office of the Vatican, and your name came up. Philippe Sands, said Bishop Chige of a wonderful Irish bishop who I've come to know. Philippe Sands, I know that name. Didn't he make that podcast called The Ratline? And Javier said, indeed, he did. And the bishop said, yes, well, it wasn't very complimentary about the Vatican, but I loved it and I'd love to meet him. One thing leads to another, and within 24 hours, I have access to the room where Otto Werther died. The reason you want to go into such a place is you're going to see and spot things. It's a 16th century room. It has extraordinary frescoes. And so I was able to see the last thing that Otto Werther ever saw in his life. And that enables you to get into the imagination. And part of the writing style of both East West Street and the Ratline is not to impose my own personal story or emotions on the reader, because every reader is intelligent, will have their own reaction and interpretation, but to tease out the moment and let the material come alive and allow each reader to form for herself or himself a sense of that place. I wanted to take, in writing that scene in the Ratline, each reader to the room to be able to imagine the dying days of a top-ranking Nazi who was indicted for mass murder, so they could enter his being themselves, if you want. It's a very personal journey in that sense.
Right. So just something about my own personal reaction and to it is that my own mother comes from that district, and she was a sole survivor of a shtetl, of a small hamlet called Bolshotze, and she would have been under the authority of Otto Werther and also Hans Frank. But in a book that I wrote about that, I went back and read that section, one of the sections, and I was actually very shocked to discover, and it was only this morning, that my grandmother, who I never knew, was put on a train with her son, after whom I'm named, and that train was headed to Belzec. And he ended up being killed just outside Lemberg in the Piasky and the ravines there. And my grandmother managed to jump off the train. And in my mother's recollection, she jumped off in the town of Zhulkiev, which is where your family comes from, and was part of the Action, the liquidation and the rounding up of the town was once again put on that train. And it made me wonder whether or not, because I quizzed my mother about it again today, whether or not my own family might have been on the same train as your family, going from Zhulkiev. Some of them were killed and let out from the synagogue, but to Belzec as well. And so, there is that personal connection, and it's interesting that in the different manifestations of this book and the evolution of it, when in the film My Nazi Legacy, you very much put yourself inside the story. There's the moment when you've got the two sons of Hans Frank and of Otto Werther at outside the synagogue of Zhulkiev, and you can see that you're holding back your emotions, and also that you're extremely frustrated that Horst, the son, won't admit to what you've called his father's criminality. In that moment, I felt that you weren't thinking about the legal distinction between criminality and involvement in mass murder. And it's that I'm trying to understand with you, how you shift and carry all these different sides of you that are expressed through the different media that you've used that ultimately comes to fruition in this book that is I've just got to say, an extraordinary book. I couldn't put it down. And not only does it read as people say like a John le Carré novel, but John le Carré is one of the people with his real name who you interview and who gives you some information about the Ratline, which we'll come to in a moment. But I'm interested how you put all that together.
I have the great fortune of living in an area with some interesting characters around, and he's one of my neighbours. And one of my roles in life for the last 20 years has been he would turn up at the front door holding a manuscript and ask me to check all the legal characters. Are they accurate? Do they sound like lawyers? Do they look like lawyers? Do they feel like lawyers? I'm a lawyer. I spend time in courtroom, and one of the golden rules for a lawyer is don't wear your emotions on your sleeve. You've got to strip out your feelings. You mentioned being in court last December with Aung San Suu Kyi, which was a remarkable experience, I have to say. Unique experience, an icon. She was defending the indefensible. But you strip out your emotion. And in a sense, that doesn't mean you have no emotion. Of course not. It doesn't mean you don't have very strong feelings. Of course not. And occasionally it slips out. And there is a moment in the making of the documentary when I go to Lviv with Nicholas Frank and Otto Wächter. It's 2014. And we're actually in the aula of the university, the main lecture hall where Hans Frank has given the speech, where I would give a lecture later on, not knowing that it was the place that he unleashed the final solution. It's in that very room. And what happens in that moment in the film is I finally found, it's taken me 2.5 years to find it. I mean, Horst has been telling me for 2 years, my father was never indicted, he wasn't involved in mass murder. And I finally find in an obscure archive in Poland, the act of indictment by the Polish and American authorities of his father. It's in the book, you've seen it, mass murder. And I show it to him and he sort of wiggles out of it. You remember the scene. And it is the one moment with Horst where, because I'm fond of him despite some of the views he has, where I lose my cool. And it happens to be a moment where my friend David Evans, the director, is filming. And so it's caught on camera. And of course, later on, David will say to me, I see the cuts and I'm not very thrilled. I don't exactly want to, be shown losing my rag, but it's his film. And the deal was it's his film. You want to put it in, David, you put it in. And he puts it in. And of course, my mother-in-law, my beloved mother-in-law, refers to it as the elder abuse scene in the film, where, this young, hungry lawyer attacks this poor old chap in Lviv. But there are just moments where your emotions spill out. And that was one of the moments where it spilled out. I mean, there are many moments where I have very deep emotions. Many of the people will have listened to the podcast, the BBC podcast. It's free to listen to. It's called The Ratline. It tells part of the story, not all of it. The book has all of the detail. But the broadcast of the podcast 2 years ago, which I purposely did before the book in the hope that it would throw out new material, which it did, produced incredibly unexpected communications. One in particular, I won't give it away now, but right at the end of the book, something happens, which was deeply, deeply affecting for me when another person from the family gets in touch out of the blue and expresses a perspective that was unexpected. So there is a lot of emotion, and I know already from the mailbag that I get, which I love getting, that it produces extraordinary reactions in people and unexpected reactions. Wächter goes on the run in 1945. He hides in the mountains. Unbelievably, I get to meet a young Waffen-SS soldier, former Waffen-SS soldier, who lives with a picture of Adolf Hitler in his room still today. Well, he passed away a year ago. When I interviewed him, there was a picture of Adolf in the background. It was pretty distressing, I have to say, and that produces an emotion too. But you're sitting in a room with the guy who escaped with Otto Wächter and who can tell you firsthand what they did, how they did it, where they went, how they lived for 3 years. And then Wächter makes it to Rome, where he is saved by a religious gentleman. I mean, it's a detective story in the sense that all of these letters are coded and we had to decrypt them and understand what was in them. We worked out who the religious gentleman was. He's a very famous, notorious bishop, one who helped famous Nazis escape to Argentina, Stangl, Priebke, perhaps also Mengele. Maybe he had a role also in relation to Eichmann. And I was talking about this on a New Zealand radio station a couple of weeks ago. And someone called in to say, yeah, I know all about Bishop Hudal, because this is the lady talking. My father was a New Zealand soldier who was fighting in Europe in the Second World War. He escaped a German prisoner of war camp, I think it was in 1944. He made his way to Rome, and in Rome, it was Bishop Hudal who saved his life and gave him refuge in the same place where he gave refuge to Otto Wächter. And the New Zealand lady didn't realize that Hudal, who became a family friend, was involved on the other side of the story also. So the moral of the story is life is never quite what it seems.
Right. So, let's imagine that he wouldn't have been able to escape on the Ratline and meet the ending that he did, and that he would have been caught and tried alongside Hans Frank, and that you are the prosecutor in the Nuremberg trials, and perhaps the role of defendant might be Horst, the son, because he does ask, he resisted, unlike his father being a lawyer. He had this artistic side, and he was never a lawyer, but he still asks, he's insistent in asking questions that a lawyer would ask. Where is the signature? You mentioned the Polish document you find, and he'll say it's Soviet propaganda. He thinks for a while, but filial loyalty leads him to find an excuse. But in doing so, he's playing the role of a lawyer. So I'm interested to know, you do say it in the book, but I want to know whether, if you were in court, as you have been many times, you know the fate of Frank, and there's always an excuse for Wächter that his son will give. Is it the cut and dry case of what? If you were prosecuting, would it be a cut and dry case of what? Of crimes against humanity, of genocide? How would you play it?
I mean, there's no question. I mean, Horst doesn't like it when I say it in his presence, as I mentioned in the book. But I mean, there's no question that if Otto Wächter had been caught, he would have been tried. If he'd been tried at Nuremberg, he'd have been tried for crimes against humanity and genocide, and he would have been convicted, and he would have been sentenced to death. I mean, his closest mate was in the courtroom, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who was the governor of Nazi-occupied Holland. Was his father's closest colleague and is Horst's godfather. And he was caught and he was tried at Nuremberg, and he had done exactly the same things as Otto Wächter. He was a governor and he was hanged. And that's what would have happened to Otto Wächter. I mean, I think there's the mechanics of the legal side, but I have to say, for me, the beating heart of the book is the personal side. And in particular, if there is one aspect of this that really drew me in, it's the family side. It's the love story between Charlotte and Otto. What was Charlotte's role? They meet in 1929 on a railway carriage from Vienna to a ski station. She gets pregnant. They get married in 1932. And she is, with him subsequently, egging him on his terrible acts in which he is involved in Krakow and Lemberg. And I think that, for me, is the fascination. What was the family life while all these terrible things were going on? And of course, there's another side of it. Because I've got the diaries and the letters, you're able to learn the intimate side of their lives, his affairs, and also the way she tries to get her own back on him. So, for example, in 1936, he has fled by then from Austria to Berlin. He has been involved in the killing of the Austrian Chancellor. And in Berlin, she discovers that he's having an affair with a young woman called Traute. She gets rid of the young woman. A year later, she falls pregnant, and they have a child. It's their third child, and it's a daughter, and a daughter is called. She names the daughter Traute after her husband's girlfriend. That should teach you a lesson, she says to him. It's these points of detail that enable you to understand how life went on. The mendacity, the corruption, the thievery. I mean, they stole art on a systematic scale. The treatment of individual human beings. There is an exchange of letters between Otto and his father, General Joseph Wächter, which is absolutely chilling for me. General Joseph Wächter writes to his son, "Oh, my dear son, you're now the governor of Krakow. There is in your district a family. I know the father. He has married a Jew. They've produced a child. That child is now wrapped up in the race laws. Could you possibly intervene to save this child?" says the father, General Joseph Wächter. Otto investigates it and responds with a chilling letter explaining why the race laws are important and why there must be no exceptions to protect society as a whole, essentially from this germ, from this virus that is threatening us. It's absolutely chilling. It is the personal letters that are far, far more chilling than the public decrees and acts of public decision-making. It's the private letters. "Tomorrow, my darling, I have to have another 50 Poles shot." That is how you understand the mind of a couple that did monstrous things. And that's what I want to get to the heart of. How do you carry on living with yourselves as two intelligent human beings embroiled in this horror? And one of the things that I looked for in 8,500 pages of private documentation is a sense of regret or remorse, and there is not a shred of it. And we're dealing not just with the contemporaneous material from the 30s and the 40s, but in the 1970s and in the 80s, right at the end of her life, Charlotte decided she would produce a record for her children of the wonders of her husband. So she goes off and tracks down old comrades, interviews them, and remarkably, she records the interviews. And so I have all the cassette tapes of her recordings. And in the course of those recordings, you hear her toasting with an old Nazi journalist about the golden days under the Führer. "Oh, I was a true Nazi," says Charlotte. "So was I," says her friend, the journalist Melita Wiedemann. "Still am," they agree. That's 1977, drinking in the cafe of the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich. It's chilling stuff. And we need to understand the minds of these individuals. And it's the personal material that helps us to understand.
So I want to come back to that. And I agree. I think that the power of this book is that discovery of all of these diaries, which Horst, in giving it to you, believes will somehow vindicate his father, and yet it gives you a window into the intimacy and a level of empathy for someone who is so monstrous. But I just want to go back to, I don't want to call it a technicality, but it really frames the basis of the link between East West Street and the Ratline, and that is that in East West Street there is you talk about Lauterpacht being the person who comes up with crimes against humanity and emphasizes crimes against individual civilians, versus Lemkin, who coins the word genocide and talks about collectives. And I think in East West Street you show more empathy for Lauterpacht's view, and Lemkin seems to struggle to get it into the Nuremberg trials. But I'm curious, if you were to have had the opportunity to prosecute Wächter in court, how you sort of reconcile or deal with both those concepts of crimes against humanity, which has evolved, and genocide. And if you could just explain to people who are listening, what is at stake in this argument that is between Lauterpacht and Lemkin, and how it would apply to prosecuting someone like Wächter.
Sure. I mean, the indictment of Otto Wächter, which emerges, I mean, he's already indicted in 1942. So early on, he's fingered, if you like, for killing Polish intellectuals, even before news of the final solution emerges. And the formal act of indictment indicts him not for crimes against humanity or genocide, but for mass murder, which encompasses, of course, both crimes against humanity and genocide. Crimes against humanity focuses on the crime of killing large numbers of individuals. Genocide focuses on the crime of the destruction of a group, and they both exist in parallel. And Wächter was, I think, plainly indictable for both crimes. I mean, he systematically killed civilians. He was involved notoriously as early as November 1939 in the roundup of academics from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, many of whom were deported and perished. But I mean, to give you a flavor of this man and what he was capable of doing, again, it's points of detail. He enters the University of Vienna Law School in the autumn of 1919, unbelievably on the same day as Hersch Lauterpacht. They are classmates at the University of Vienna Law School. And I did an amazing event at the university last December to mark the centenary of the simultaneous entry of Lauterpacht and Wächter into the law school. It was an unbelievable event. I mean, we were literally hanging from the rafters. So he studies at the University of Vienna Law School. He has a number of teachers. I have student records. Some of his teachers are Jewish. By now, 1920s, he has in 1921 already been sentenced to a week imprisonment for beating up Jews. In 1923, he joins the Nazi Party, and we've got his student membership card. Fast forward 15 years, after the Anschluss, he comes back to Vienna from Berlin. His wife brings him back, and he stands on the balcony overlooking the Heldenplatz next to Adolf Hitler. I mean, you're talking about someone who is right at the pinnacle of power here. He then accepts a job in government, and he works with Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who becomes the new governor of the incorporated state of Austria into the Reich. And his first job is as a state commissioner, responsible for removing all Jews from public office. And indeed, there will be viewers of this conversation whose families will have been on the receiving end of Otto Wächter's generosity of spirit. He targets every person who is a Jew who's in public office, and that includes university teachers, which is a public function. And unbelievably, he removes two of his own teachers from their positions as professors at the University of Vienna Law School. One of them was his dean at the law school. One of them, as his dean, signed his graduation certificate. That individual is stripped of his position, is deported, and is dead within a year in one of the concentration camps. I mean, as a university teacher, I know I'm a barrister, but I'm also a university teacher at the University of London at UCL. The idea that in 20 years' time, one of my students would target me in this way is so mind-boggling as to the capacities they had to do these kinds of things. That the critical question is, how could it be done? It's not about, in the case of the Wächters, the banality of evil. The banality of evil somehow suggests you sleepwalk into these acts of horror and extermination. Otto Wächter went into it knowingly and willingly and with purpose. That is both a crime against humanity and a genocide. And equally shocking is that his wife Charlotte knew exactly what he was up to because he was writing home about it. And she absolutely supported it because it opened up to her a world of Bayreuth and the Salzburg Festival and drinks parties and cocktail parties and film receptions and a life of absolute glamour. One of the things you should be aware of is that I discovered that the Wächters appropriated a home in Vienna in 1938, the Villa Mendel, owned by Bettina Mendel, whose daughter lives today in Australia, I think up near Brisbane. Her name is Phyllis Macduff, and I have located in Horst's house, at the Schloss where he lives, Bettina Mendel's China tea set. And I'm trying to persuade Horst to give it back, and he wants to give it back, but it costs an arm and a leg to send it back to Australia. So I'm in touch with Phyllis Macduff, I'm in touch with Horst, and I want to bring this tea set back to Australia. And I'm hoping that by the time I turn up in Australia next spring of March, April, May 2021, and travel is permitted again, I will be able to bring parts of the tea set with me and deliver them personally to Phyllis Macduff up near Brisbane.
Yeah, that's a remarkable story, and I took note with that Australian connection with one of the villas, the Villa Mendel, that there was an Australian connection there. So if we move now to the title of your book, The Ratline, one of the things that intrigued me was how complicit and entangled so many of the motives were for concealing Nazis, giving them safe passage. And I don't want to spoil what happens at the end of your book to what you conclude about Bechtel, but you have the role of the Vatican and priests playing this role, and you even talk about, at one point you go to the Vatican and you look at the caged archives of Pope Pius XII, and which I think since writing it have now been open to historians. I don't know if there'd be any more information there, but I'm interested. There are all of these players that make it easy, some for their own motives. So the Vatican, if you go to the Museum of the Red Cross in Geneva, they talk about contrition for Theresienstadt and concealing what happened there, but they're also giving passports out quite easily, and I don't know it's not clear to what end or what purpose why they were giving the passports out, and then you have anti-communist agents and American counterintelligence, and if you can just say something about the Ratline, which primarily led to South America, but also led to Australia and to most countries.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think most of us had heard of something called the Ratline. We don't know much about it. We knew that there was this way that Nazis got from Europe, Italy in particular. There was an escape route to South America and South Africa and Australia and other parts of the world. But what we've never had before this archive is the internal material of how a man, Otto Wächter, who arrives in Rome on the 29th of April 1949, hoping to get onto the Ratline. Who does he go and see? Who helps him? Who knows he's there? Who are his assets, so to speak? And of course, I'm not a historian. I didn't know about this period. And of course, I didn't know about the details of the way in which the Cold War conflict engulfed Italy. But very soon, as I'm going through his materials, I come to understand that he has hooked up with senior Vatican officials. I mean, to give you an example, I was stunned when I discovered that Pope Pius XII's primary spokesperson for the press, his press spokesperson, we'd call it today, was an American spy reporting daily to the Americans. So he hooks up with people like that. He hooks up with old SS officers who are sort of gone underground. He hooks up with senior members of the Italian fascist party, some of whom are imprisoned because it's an illegal act. But most remarkably, these three categories, the Vatican officials, old Nazis, and Italian fascists, have a new ally. And who's the new ally? It's us. It's the Brits and the Americans and the Australians, who are basically working with them against the new threat, which is the communist threat. And this, of course, blew me away. And you mentioned earlier my neighbour John Le Carre. He knows a thing or two about this. He's written about this. You want to read a great book, read The Perfect Spy, because it is a different aspect of this story. So I went and had tea with him. He said, send me a few bits and pieces and I'll tell you how it worked. I sent him some of the documents that you can now read about in the book, and I described the conversations with him in the book. And I turn up with a few cakes from the local bakery, because he likes his cakes, as I do, and we're drinking cups of tea. And he says, I know all about this, Philippe, because I was there. I said, what do you mean you were there? He said, I was there in 1949. I was an 18-year-old soldier, British soldier. And I thought I was hunting Nazis, but I wasn't. I was recruiting them. We turned on a sixpence. We suddenly were bringing onto our own side mass murderers, people who were SS intelligence officers. And I was absolutely incredulous. I mean, you pick it up in the pages of the book. If you want to listen to his voice, you can hear his voice. It's episode 6 of the podcast of the Ratline. You can hear that moment where I say to him, what do you mean you were there? Where he actually tells me he was present, and his job, as he interrogated Nazis, was not for the purpose of prosecuting them, but for the purpose of recruiting them. And this, of course, for me, interested in justice, is a crucial aspect of the story, because it turns out that our country's own commitment to a model of justice, in implementing crimes against humanity and genocide, was corrupted 4 years after it had been invented. Within 3 years of the close of the Nuremberg trial, we have brought senior mass murdering Nazis onto our side. And it's not as though we didn't know what these people had done. We did it with an open mind and an open eye. And this, of course, blew me away. And I think a lot of people's reaction to the Ratline, the book, is absolute horror at the detail of this complicity between these different forces. And of course, it's deeply relevant today, because we see the same constellation and alliances today in relation to Russia and, of course, the new enemy, particularly in the context of coronavirus, China. And you see the alliances coming together in curious ways to target the new enemy. And I think one of the things I learned in writing the Ratline is take great care. Things are not always exactly what they seem, and you need to scratch and see what is below the surface.
Right. So I'm going to invite people now to start asking questions, and I look at it, and while people are doing that, I just want to probe a bit deeper into you opening up the question of our contemporary situation. Now, you use the word for whitewashing Nazis that this whole process of the Ratline tried to do with Persilshine, which is using detergent.
Yeah.
Right, it's a form of detergent to cleanse someone. And as we know, the president of a great country in the world had made the recommendation to use detergent to cleanse us of the virus. But yeah, I think there's been a spate of articles that have been trying to draw links between the Spanish flu and the pandemic then, and some of the origins of the crisis of democracies. And there's been an argument to and fro about that. I think it's in East West Street, you say that Lemkin started thinking about the idea of collective mass murder that would eventually lead him to the word genocide around the same time as he loses his brother to the Spanish flu. And I'm interested in your view on how you see, based on everything that you've been studying, and you say you're not an historian, but I think that it's one of the many accolades we can give you in writing this book, because you research and you do construct an historical narrative that's incredibly readable, a page turner. What you can learn from this period about good and evil. I think you called your performance a song of good and evil, and what you see happening in the world with illiberal democracies emerging. You've talked about new alliances and how a crisis like this pandemic that is forcing us to speak to resume might have an influence on that.
Well, it's impossible, not to live the experience. I'm in lockdown as you are. I'm living in wonderful conditions, in Hampstead in London. We have a garden and we have a decent sized house. And so compared to many people, we're living in extraordinarily good conditions. But I can't say that it isn't tough. And I can't say also that it's not concerning to see what's going on. I mean, the world can basically take two paths going forward. One path is the path of cooperation, working out what on earth happened and making sure it does not happen again. Or the world can go in the path of conflict and, shutting the barriers, building walls, turning inwards, and fueling even further the rise of nationalism. I think the real concern that I have, given the parallels, and history doesn't repeat itself, but it does draw on its past, I think, in certain ways, is is the economic consequences of this, which I think we haven't even begun to imagine. I mean, in Britain, they're probably going to be greater than in Australia, but we're talking about potentially mass unemployment. And that has very serious consequences, because once people are out of work, once people have no income, feelings of anger rise. And that, coupled with right now the launching, in particular in relation to China, finger pointing. I mean, my own view is we've got to get out of this. There's got to be a reckoning at some point. I'm actually in favour at some point of an international inquiry. I support the Australian government's proposal for that, but I wonder if it was wise to raise that now. We're right in the middle of this. We need to hang together to get out of it. That's the most important thing, to basically get rid of this virus from our lives. You've managed it in Australia. You've done magnificently. So has New Zealand. Britain, I'm afraid to say, is in an absolutely shocking state with an utterly incompetent government. We have no idea where we're going. People are supposed to be going back to work today and schools opening soon when the virus is all around. I know people who are affected. I know people who have died from it. So it's a very real and present danger. And I think the lesson of the period you're talking about, of where this could go, is a very real one, and we need to be very attentive to these possibilities. I opt for the cooperative route. Yes, there needs to be a reckoning, but gently, let's get out of this mess first, and then make darn sure it doesn't happen again.
Right. And just related to that question, you've dedicated your life to tracing the roots of international law in all its formats, and from Nuremberg and to the present. And I'm just interested. You told me I can ask you any question, and you're ready for surprise questions. But I'm interested if you have a concern about the attack on international legal institutions such as the ICC for self-interest, and perhaps, given that this conversation is about sort of, is for Melbourne Jewish Book Week, I'm interested if you have a view on some of the attacks on the International Criminal Court, in particular sort of by Israel, America's view of the ICC, and how you see the future of international law, and whether it's being weakened through this pandemic, where people are turning back to borders and nationalism.
I mean, these are very delicate issues, and reasonable people can disagree. And my views are emerging on all these things. One of the things that is clear is that there is an attack on law and institutions, and in particular, there is an attack on the law and institutions that were created in that incredible moment in 1945. What is so distressing is that 1945 settlement, a rule of law moment, was essentially led by the United Kingdom, the United States. Australia played a very central role, and there were other countries that were involved. The countries that are turning their back on that order are those very same countries. The attack on the 1945 order is being led unbelievably by the United States, with the United Kingdom as its principal cheerleader. I'm not sufficiently placed to understand quite what is the position of Australia on these things, but I suspect it's not so far from Britain and the United States. Putting it another way, who would have imagined, sitting in the Nuremberg courtroom on the 20th of November 1945, the 75th anniversary will be celebrated this November in the courtroom, in the presence, coronavirus permitting, and I will be there with the President of Germany. Who would have imagined that in November 2020, the chief flag carrier for the idea of the rule of law and liberal democracy is Germany? It's not the United Kingdom. It's not the United States. It may not even be Australia. Who would have thought that? And what does that mean for where we are going? What on earth happened that the turnaround happened in that way, that we ended up with the presidents and the prime ministers that we've got in the United Kingdom and the United States? I say nothing about Australia because I am much less aware of that. And of course, equally, we're on the cusp, apparently, of an annexation by Israel of territories that are occupied. I am a child of the Anschluss. My mother was born in Vienna in July 1939. I think I know something about annexation and occupation and what it means and what it leads to. So I am filled with anxiety about this moment when the bastions of liberal democracy appear to have turned against it. Now, it is not too late to do something about it. And my hope is that both countries and their electorates will come to their senses. And I have hopes too for Israel, a country which is entitled and has a right to live within safe borders, not being attacked with rockets going in from other areas. But it's a very dangerous moment, I think, that we're about to enter into.
Right. And just because of time, one last question that's coming from someone who's listening. And what's your next project? And does it grow out of the books in this complicated way?
I've got a small writing project on colonialism. I've been involved in a case concerning the Chagos Archipelago, part of Mauritius, and I'm going to write something about that. But there is a third book in what will now be a trilogy, a sort of justice trilogy. Justice Otto Wächter was a bit part player in the East-West Street story. The attentive reader in Australia, you may have noticed him, involves a bit part player called Walter Rauf. When Wächter arrives in Rome in April 1949, he's parked in a monastery called the Vigna Pia in Rome, and he occupies a monk's cell which has recently been vacated by one of his former SS comrades, Walter Rauf. Walter Rauf has left for Syria, where he is living and from where he writes to Wächter, and then makes his way to South America, eventually ending up in Chile in 1955. He becomes a small businessman in Chile, and in 1973, he becomes, it is said, an interrogator for the regime of Augusto Pinochet. Pause for a moment. Walter Rauf, you will be interested to know, is the inventor of the mobile gas chamber. In 1973, he's working for the government of Chile, apparently, and he interrogates a young Chilean writer called Leon Gomez and tortures him. And the affidavit of that act is one of the documents that reaches me in London 25 years later in 1998, in one of the cases you mentioned at the outset, the arrest of Senator Pinochet in London. And so the whole story, if you like, comes full circle. It lands on my desk by unbelievable coincidence while I am on the very day that I'm due to attend my grandfather's stone setting at the cemetery in Paris, since we're Jewish Book Week in Melbourne, the point of connection with my grandfather and being in the Jewish section of the Pantin Cemetery, with the connection between Pinochet and Walter Rauf, seems yet another extraordinary coincidence. But the last book in the trilogy will be Pinochet in London, and in particular the story of Walter Rauf.
Right. So some questions are popping up now, but unfortunately we have to end this conversation. I just want to, you can see it here, urge everyone to get this book. They've been, even though readings in the Avenue have been physically closed, there are ways of accessing the book, and it really is I've just completed reading it, and it's an extraordinary book, and I urge everyone to buy it, because there's so much that we can learn from it. And I want to thank you, Philippe, for giving your time in London and being part of this conversation. But I particularly want to also thank Melbourne Jewish Book Week, that had developed an incredible program of speakers, appointed a new director who has been involved in this conversation, Nicholas Brash, and also Lisa Clipfish, who's the general manager. So I just want to thank the whole team from Melbourne Jewish Book Week for putting this event together. And I hope for many reasons that next year that we'll be having face-to-face conversations. But you were right to say in the beginning that there is an intimacy that you can achieve here on Zoom. Our world is changing, and we've got a long road ahead of us. But while we're in quarantine and lockdown, beginning to ease off, get hold of this book, and it will get you through the next few days. That's all it will take to read it. So thank you, Philippe, for joining us here in Australia.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jewish Book Week. It's terrific to be part of this, and I genuinely hope, I really hope to be with you next year. Thank you so much.